I think there's an interesting note now about what we consider mainstream, because if you look at the most streamed artists on Spotify, obviously Taylor Swift reaches that top spot, but she would often switch back and forth with The Weeknd depending when she'd have an album release. But when I have asked people, let's say in like the Gen X and upwards generation, they have no idea who The Weeknd is, but of course they know who Taylor Swift is. Even though they're receiving the same amount of Spotify streams, there is a big difference there in terms of wide recognizability. And that thought process came about because, just scrolling through YouTube as you do, and I came across Alex Cooper from Call Her Daddy, which I think is like the biggest podcast in the world for women. And she was doing some like late night stuff. And despite her having the biggest podcast once again for women, which is 50% of the entire planet, there is absolutely no chance that the average sort of Gen X person, or probably the average person, would have any idea who she is and what that podcast is in general, despite once again being the biggest podcast for women on Spotify. That's a pretty big demographic for it to not be considered mainstream. And I wondered whether maybe it's because while you can have like this big garden of people who are listening to you, it's a very walled garden that you cannot see from the outside because its ecosystem is purely on Spotify. It's not like you see billboards and posters and stadium tours and your friends are talking about going to that artist show and chucking on their story. And there's not as many clips from it because it's on Spotify, so you don't get that same clipping that you do with like YouTube podcasts and things like that. So once again, it just builds a very walled garden, a very big garden, but still very walled up around it, and hence doesn't have that same wide exposure. Once again, same with Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift does a lot of broad stuff. She does a lot of shows. She does a lot of like public activities. Unlike The Weeknd, which I don't remember the last time hearing him do anything but like the Super Bowl or something like that. And you had this whole thing for years and years and years where like, how many years did it take for Mr. Beast to be considered mainstream? What, probably when he did that Squid Games video, which to be honest, I think is nowhere near one of his best videos, yet people consider it one of his greatest. It's just not. But the point being, that got like 200 million views. So he had to get 200 million views before he was considered A-list. Imagine like TV shows getting that. TV shows are lucky to get like 10 million views for like a top primetime episode. So to getting tens and tens and tens of millions of views, let alone the hundreds and hundreds of millions it's getting now, just to be considered mainstream, it's a big shift from what it used to be. Part of it, I wonder, like pretty much every demographic has influences that they follow. Except I don't think that middle-aged straight white men tend to have an influencer that they follow. And if these are the people that tend to be in charge of like production studios and TV networks and business and corporate and things like that, hence this whole industry is going to be undervalued because they're not in the conversation and they're like, oh, that's just something my kids watch, not that your kids watch it. It's the biggest industry on the planet right now and no one's in your circles discussing it, so maybe you should pay attention to it. And I wonder how much that plays into the fact that it took so many years, despite the huge viewership, despite the huge parasocial connection and hence ability for a creator to influence an audience, how many years that took just to be valued as it should be. Every young person knows the Sidemen, but no adult would, no Gen X plus person would know them, yet one of their members, a company that's worth tens of billions of dollars, is in every store, yet, they'll obviously just walk past because it doesn't stand out. They're like, okay, cool, another drink amongst hundreds of drinks. Not the fact that, once again, it is the fastest growing drink product probably in history. And it goes back into this whole thing about the dedicated community, the fact that you can have these powerful communities that are so committed to whatever the cause is, and yet, a whole world doesn't even have to know about it, and yet it can still exist. So I don't know what kind of the premise of this discussion is, what this is meant to lead to, but I think it's an interesting point of discussion or thought that you can have these massive gardens that no one outside even knows